exclusive programming for Comcast subscribers.
Welcome to Civil Discourse. My name is Ken Hurley, and this is a program sponsored by the American Civil Liberties Union of Greater Jacksonville, Florida. And in the studio with us, we have a woman named Ambassador Nancy Soderberg, who began her political career as a volunteer delegate counter in 1982 and became the third highest ranking member of the National Security Council. She had an office in the West Wing, flew around the world on Air Force One, negotiated peace treaties, had many meetings with President Bill Clinton, and has over 20 years of experience in the formation of United States foreign policy. She has promoted democracy and conflict resolution worldwide and achieved international recognition for her efforts to promote peace in Northern Ireland. She's participated in United Nations missions to Indonesia, East Timor, negotiated key United Nations resolutions regarding the Middle East and Africa. She has been to Vietnam, Angola, Japan, Russia, around the world. She is currently a distinguished visiting scholar at the University of North Florida. And if that isn't enough, she has written a book recently published by John Wiley called The Superpower Myth, The Use and Misuse of American Might. And this book analyzes the use of force and diplomacy over the last decade. Ambassador Soderberg, thank you for being here on Civil Discourse and taking time out of your busy schedule. This is a great title, The Use and Misuse of American Might, The Superpower Myth. I'm curious, why did you choose the word misuse as opposed to abuse?
Well, I think that over the last 5 years, we have gotten the use of force and diplomacy wrong. That's not to say that President Clinton didn't have some early challenges in trying to redefine the use of American might after the Cold War, but I think if you look at the use of force under the Bush administration, the war in Iraq and the way it's been used, I think is a misuse. I'm trying to be diplomatic. Some would say abuse, but I think they didn't purposely doing it. I think they sort of stumbled into it.
Well, you know, negotiating peace treaties is not an easy thing. How do you approach that? I mean, how is persistence necessary? Is trust necessary? Are peace treaties successful when diplomacy works? What does it take for diplomacy work? And does it work better when you have the threat and the will to use force behind you?
It depends. I negotiated the Irish peace process, trying to convince the IRA to give up its campaign of terrorism and violence. Back in the 90s, there were 200 or 300 people dying every year. Use of force in that situation would not really be particularly helpful. You're not going to go bomb the IRA from the United States perspective. What you had to do there is convince both sides, the Unionist and the Protestants and the Catholic side, the Unionist and Nationalist side, and the governments, that both sides could gain by moving forward. In other words, it was not a zero-sum game. In other cases, for instance, in Haiti, negotiating the return of President Aristide or ending Milosevic's campaign of ethnic slaughter.
There, with force
in Bosnia, there you had to have force. He would not have come to the table at Dayton in 1995 had we not had the use of force to back up that diplomacy. So every situation is different.
How do you, and now you're in the National Security Council, the third highest ranking member. These are meetings chaired by the President of the United States, and you're at the table, the Vice President is there, when you were doing it, the CIA was there, and there was a whole, the Secretary of Defense was there. A lot of high-powered, very, very influential individuals sitting around a table talking about national security, foreign policy, when to use diplomacy, when to use force. Is it just a matter of who's sitting around the table that decides diplomacy force? How does that discussion actually work?
Well, first of all, the Situation Room itself is, most people who have seen the movie Dr. Strangelove thinks it's going to be all sort of fancy gadgets and maps. It's just a small wood-paneled room with about 12 seats around the table. And it's an interagency process. It starts at lower levels where people kind of come up with options. It goes up to the deputies level and then the cabinet level, principals committee meetings. And I remember many times when President Clinton would say, I don't like any of these options you've developed. Go back and come up with better ones. And we'd all say, that's why you get paid the big bucks. There are no good options here. Often you have to choose between options that you don't really like. It'd be much better, for instance, to have been able to negotiate a peace settlement in Bosnia without having to use force. To be able to negotiate it, but sometimes it doesn't work. Look at Iran today, for instance. There are no good options right now in Iran. Military forces on the table. I don't think it's a advisable course of action. I don't really think it's as on the table as those in Washington are hyping it up, but negotiations are not particularly fruitful at this stage. So I would not want to be sitting around that table right now saying, what do we do about Iran, for instance? So it's
is Iran just a matter of when and who's going to do it? Or do you think the Israelis might do it instead of the United States?
Well, I think I think that we missed a window of opportunity 3 or 4 years ago when there was a more responsible president in power in Iran. Where the Europeans were trying to negotiate it. That was back then when we didn't do carrots or negotiations, axis of evil, all of that. You now have a very hardline, somewhat erratic president who denies the Holocaust happened, wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, and has clearly made the decision that he's going to pursue a nuclear weapons program. And the international community has tried to come together to convince him not to do that. And Russia's really key here. If the Russians would get on board and try and convince Iran that it's more costly to pursue that program than not, but the Russians are unwilling to do that right now. So there's an empty thread in the Security Council. So there's, I think the best way forward, you've got a little time here. It's not going to happen tomorrow. So they need to build international support to get the international pressure, get some meaningful threats of sanctions on board, and hopefully sanity will prevail in Tehran. But it's not clear that that's going to happen. That's why the military option does remain on the table.
Why does diplomacy work sometimes and fail other times? How can you get people who typically seem to be unreasonable toward each other, adversaries, to become reasonable and agree that this is a better way? Are they just worn out from fighting all the time?
I think you have to convince the participants in any peace process that it's in their interest to move forward. Otherwise, the only way you're going to get them to do it is use force. And so in the Irish peace process, for instance, we convinced both sides that they would gain from a peace process. The Protestant side was petrified that they were going to lose Northern Ireland and it was just going to become part of Ireland without their say. The IRA thought that the British would never listen to them. Therefore, the only way they could get them to listen to them was the use of force. And all of a sudden, a new path opened up for negotiations, and they trusted the United States to be an honest broker between sides that really had lost all sorts of trust. The same with the Oslo peace process in the 1990s in the Middle East. The PLO and the Israelis, there was such distrust and hatred that they needed a third party there to move the process forward. So everyone is different, but ultimately you can force countries to change, but that takes military force, and you can't do that everywhere. So you have to, the United States brings credibility to a process, brings trust on both sides, and it takes time is the other thing.
When you're sitting at a table around the National Security Council, do you ever consider the United States Constitution? Does that ever come up in a discussion? Do you ever worry about what Congress might say in terms of making a first strike or a preemptive strike or those kinds of discussions? Do you ever actually use the phrase, well, what about the civil liberties aspect of this? Is this illegal if we wiretap without a warrant? Not that you did that necessarily, but do those considerations come up as national security when nowadays we hear that security almost always seems to be trumping almost everything regarding civil liberties?
Well, I think it depends on the cast of characters around the room. Under President Clinton, the first question out of everyone's mind was not what would Ken Hurley and the ACLU think, but it was certainly a balance of, is this right? How far do you go? There were, lots of debates back and forth on how far to move various intelligence issues forward, but also, just general policies, as you try and shape national security issues, you want to have a healthy balance there. And I think that's very much part of the debate. I think the pendulum has swung way too far on the other side right now. Certainly, there is no reason the administration can't get a warrant to wiretap Americans. There is a justification for wiretapping Americans, I believe, if there is reasonable suspicion.
Sure.
But then there's no reason not to get a warrant.
If you're talking to Al-Qaeda and it looks like you might be conspiring,
you can get a warrant pretty easily.
That's probable cause right there to get a warrant. You can get the warrant.
And there's no reason that you can't get a warrant. Plus, there is the FISA law is very clear. You need a warrant. So either they need to go change the law, which I think
they're talking about doing that right now.
Well, given the mood on Congress, they could probably get that. I think there's a healthy balance in that law, that you want to have a good checks and balance, and the pendulum has clearly swung too far. Over time, I think it will come back, and there'll be a healthy
Without
balance
a warrant,
back.
there is no check or balance.
Right.
That means the executive branch can do pretty much whatever they want, and we have to rely on them and our trust and their trustworthiness that what they are doing is what they say they are doing. But the whole point of having checks and balances, so to kind of minimize us having to trust them, is for them to demonstrate probable cause. That's why we get a warrant.
Well, it's the whole debate with the Patriot Act right now, which was passed in the rush of emotion after September 11th, and I think rightly so. There were time limits on some of those provisions that now that the sort of situation has calmed down somewhat, people can analyze those and balance them and adjust them in various ways, which did happen. I think that review is crucial.
Your book is titled The Superpower Myth. The Superpower Myth, the use and misuse of American might. Talk about the word superpower. We hear, or I hear at least, that we are now America is the only superpower in the world. Is that true?
Absolutely.
What is a superpower, and how do you distinguish that from a power?
A superpower is an unrivaled nation on not just military, but economic, cultural, moral. We are the leader of the nation on the whole panoply of issues. Now, our moral authority has been eroded somewhat over the last few years, but that can return if the policies shift. And the myth, the superpower myth, is the mistaken fallacy, the dangerous fallacy that because we are the lone superpower, we can bend the world to our will on our own without allies and without the support.
Right.
And we found that out in spades in Iraq, and I think what the Bush administration is now coming to realize is that to meet the challenges of today, we need to become once again the great persuader, not just the great enforcer. In Iran, we cannot solve Iran on our own. North Korea, we cannot solve North Korea, nor can we go to war in all these places.
Can we solve Iraq on our own? No, we're turning to the
trying,
Iraqis.
and it's not
we're
working
turning
out
to the
so well.
Iraqis to help us, but it's turning out to be a nightmare.
It is.
That's why President Bush number 41 chose to stop before he went into Baghdad. He did not go into Baghdad because he knew what would happen.
If you read President Bush's book, he predicts exactly what's going to happen in justifying
his decision. Talking about Herb Walker Bush.
First President Bush, when he chose not to go into Baghdad after the Gulf War in 1991, basically said we would have to occupy it for a long time, deal with the sectarian violence, and he knew what was going to happen.
People complain that he went in and there's no exit strategy. I'm suggesting maybe there's no exit strategy because they never planned to leave.
No, I think they do plan to leave, and I think we will leave. The exit strategy is to have some semblance of a stable government. It won't be a perfect Jeffersonian democracy, but some stable government, and most importantly, a Iraqi police and military force to whom we can hand over the monumental task of maintaining security. Now, to build an army and a police force takes years. That is our exit strategy, is to have a sufficiently capable force that can take over the job of security.
Do you think we're going in the right direction in Iraq?
I do. I think it's going to take a long time. Whether there's a civil war in the process is the big question right now. I think over time the Iraqis will realize that it's in their interest to have the insurgency subside and to begin to create a government that's democratically based and power sharing between the three main parts.
Are we actually, in fact, liberating Iraq? Do you see it as a liberation? Have we been met as liberators?
Well, we thought we were going to be met as liberators, and we've been met primarily as occupiers who made one mistake after another. The Abu Ghraib prison scandal, for instance, so eroded our moral authority in the country. The mistakes of disbanding the army, banning anyone who was part of the Ba'athist Party, took away some of the brightest civil servants who just signed up because that's what one did back then.
I have a million questions. We're going to take a short break. When we get back, I want to ask you if you watch The West Wing on television. You're watching Civil Discourse, a program sponsored by the American Civil Liberties Union. My name is Ken Hurley, and we're talking with Nancy Soderberg, an ambassador of the United Nations, currently a distinguished visiting professor at the University of North Florida. Take a look at these messages. We'll be right back.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine.
In these turbulent times, let us not erode the liberties our country was built on.
Let it shine.
Larry Parker, National Honor Society student. Patricia Stevenson, stockbroker. Hector Desario, systems analyst. Driving while black or brown isn't a crime. If it's happened to you, call us at 1-8776-PROFILE and arrest the racism.
Welcome back to Civil Discourse. My name is Ken Hurley, and you're watching a program sponsored by the American Civil Liberties Union of Greater Jacksonville, Florida, and we're talking to Ambassador Soderberg. Well, have you ever actually watched The West Wing on television?
I have.
You had an office in The West Wing, didn't you?
I did.
Worked right there. How
Worked
accurate
right
is
off
that
the
show?
Situation Room. I've
show?
actually been out to the set too. I did a little bit of advising for them,
Really?
so I got to see the set and meet some of the actors. It's a great show. It's very accurate as far as the issues and the back and forth. Where it's not accurate is nobody looks that good in The West Wing. You're tired, you haven't made it to the beauty parlor, your nails are never done. And the lights are a lot brighter in the White House.
It's so dimly lit on that program.
I know,
right?
I keep saying turn the lights up. But it looks better for TV, and it's a great show, and I hate to see it ending
It's
now.
going off the air, I know.
It's unfortunate because it's very accurate, and I think it's done a good job of getting the American public interested in public service.
Not everybody watches it, but you give it high marks on accuracy.
Very much so.
Good.
It's very good, and they do a really good job of researching it. When I've talked to them, they try to really get to the heart of what's realistic, what would really be happening.
It's 24/7, basically. You're on call all the time, right?
You are, and you don't plan to have much of a family life or personal life there. You're there pretty much from about 7:30 in the morning till 8 or 9 at night.
Is it always work, or is there any time for fun?
There's some time for fun. People are human. You got to take a little comedy break every now and then, particularly when you're on the road traveling. That's when I loved getting on Air Force One and flying around, because that's when you could relax, and the president loved to play cards, and you'd sort of have some downtime on the plane, which
I noticed that
lovely.
one, I don't remember what the reason was, but there's you mentioned something about the first time the president called you out to the putting green off the West Wing or in the White House, and you said to yourself, I've never been there.
I didn't even know there was a putting green. It's a little, just off the Oval Office, there's a little putting green that I think Eisenhower put in. And presidents go out there and think and try and work through the world's problems. And that particular incident was, we were about 2 years into the Bosnia War, and he just was not happy with the options that he was getting. And he was demanding more creative, more forceful options, which ultimately led to the Dayton Peace Accord in 1995, which ended the war.
What enticed you as a young person to get into foreign policy? How did that fall out for you? You didn't wake up one day in high school and say, you know what, I think I'm going to aspire to be the third highest ranking member of the National Security Council.
No, in high school I was convinced I was going to be a marine biologist. I loved math and science, and when I got to college, it didn't excite me anymore, and I had no idea what I was going to do. Went to graduate school, and this one pushy professor kept saying, you should go into politics. And I said, ugh, I don't like politicians. I grew up in the Watergate era, which was not an inspiring way to go. And I finally said, well, I was in Washington, why not try it? And this professor happened to be Madeleine Albright, who I had no idea had contacts in the White House or politics. And she got me my first job, and I just fell in love with it. And that's why I always tell students, I'm teaching at the University of North Florida now, which is a fantastic school. And I try and tell them, go get internships. You may think you want to be a marine biologist, but go try it. You know, you try internships and get some real life experience to try and see it. And I've never left. I loved it.
and aspiring and getting to be the third highest ranking member of the National Security Council. A lot of people don't know what the National Security Council is. It was started in 1947 as a result of the tragedy of World War II and all of the failures of diplomacy. Is it true to say that diplomacy always fails when you use force?
Not at all. Often the threat of force will make diplomacy successful. For instance, when we were trying to restore President Aristide to power in Haiti, it was only once the junta in power knew that the 82nd Airborne was in the air that they said, oh, okay, I guess you're serious, we'll leave. We never had to deploy that military force. We did end up putting troops on the ground, but in a peaceful, accepting environment. Other times with the negotiating with Milosevic, he didn't think we were going to use force, so we did have to use force to finally get him to yes at the Dayton peace process. So each one is different.
Do you think we're spread too thin around the world with our military? I understand between the military camps that we have and the military bases that we have, there's literally hundreds of them, and maybe even more. I don't know the exact number, but we are literally in every corner of the world. Do we belong there? Are we too thin? Somebody commented to me that it's almost like we're the Roman legion, like we have this empire. And it's always been my view that all empires fail because we can't afford to keep them.
Well, the difference between the United States and the previous empires is we aren't trying to control other peoples. We do happen to be in Iraq right now, but that's hopefully a short-term issue. We want to get out. We don't want to control the oil. We don't want to end up being there for any longer than we need to be. But the military is stretched thin right now, particularly with the mistakes that have been made in the Iraq War. We are there with, I think, it's about 130,000 right now, and they're there for the foreseeable future. They'll have some symbolic drawdowns, but until there's an Iraqi security force to whom we can turn that over, those troops are going to be there at that same level. Now, if there were a conflict in North Korea, Iran, somewhere else, we would be very hard stretched to do this.
Do you think there's a way to pull in and to withdraw some of these troops, or are we committed across the world?
Well, when you invade a country, it's like the sign in a china shop. You break it, you own it.
That's
Tom
true.
Friedman's favorites,
right,
and I think he's right. And I think it'd be irresponsible just to pull out and leave a mess behind. But I do think that Iraq will ultimately work at great cost to American blood and treasure. And Americans will debate for decades to come, centuries to come, whether that was the right use of American blood and treasure and the right cost to Americans, particularly as it's clear that there was no imminent threat from Iraq to do this. Now, that said, I think over time, Iraq is likely to be better off. Whether it was worth that investment is a big debate here in this country that will continue. And we don't know the end of the story or the final price tag either. I think you'll ultimately will get an Iraq government there. I think you will ultimately have the insurgency begin to fade, and I think we will eventually get an Iraqi military and police force that can take over the job of maintaining security, but that's probably a couple of years away still.
You've earned the right to be called a professional peacemaker because you've done it. You've actually negotiated peace treaties successfully, and you've seen successes and you've witnessed failures around the world. Why is peace so difficult?
Mostly because of fear. I think that the combatants in most conflicts today are fearful of losing what they care about in a peace treaty right now. You look at the Middle East right now, I think the Israelis are getting more and more fearful that they're never going to have a decent partner in the Palestinians. I think the Palestinians are fearful that they are never going to have a decent life. Their leadership has repeatedly failed them. Now you have an elected government that in Hamas that wants to destroy Israel, will not renounce terrorism. And there's just a lot of fear. That's why the United States role is so important. If they can get in there and begin to give hope to both sides that they'll gain from a peace process as opposed to lose, then you have progress. And that's why the U.S. role in these is so important. When the U.S. gets in and says, well, here's what we think will happen. I remember negotiating with the British and the IRA. The British would come to me and, can you tell me that Jerry Adams will do this? I'll say, no, but here's what he's told us. And Irish America will jump all over him if he doesn't do it. And I think that would it begins to create a little bit more confidence in the process, and that's why the role of the superpower is so key in these negotiations.
And peace is difficult because people are afraid to give up what they have. They're afraid to capitulate. They're not willing to make some sort of a compromise.
Exactly.
Their heels are dug in. It's my way or you take the
deadliest but do you know where the deadliest conflict in the world right now is? Put you on the spot.
The deadliest conflict? No, tell me.
It's the Congo. The Democratic
Congo.
Republic in
And
Congo.
you say that in your book.
Yes, and that book I finished 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, and it's still, most people are focused on Darfur right now, which we're doing a terrible job of stopping as well. But in the Congo, you've got all the parties that are in power right now that have the power to make the transition move forward, think that they're going to be worse off if they move it forward. Now, they personally might not be making as much money, but the country itself will be much better. And so we need to get them on board by putting some international pressure on their continued intransigence and say, your game is up. You've got to move this forward or you're going to begin to suffer. And that's where the international community can help send that message. Every participant in the peace process is human, and they all make their own calculus as what's better for me.
Is world peace attainable? I mean, from a,
not in our generation.
Is it just something we aspire to, or just because we're built on a war economy? We've got Eisenhower and his great exit speech when he left the office talking about the military-industrial complex and the war.
Well, there's a very interesting report funded by the Canadian government called the Human Security Report that shows there is a dramatic decrease in deaths from war around the world. It used to be about 30 or 40,000 a year. Now it's about 600 a year on average. And that is largely because the UN and other countries have gotten in and negotiated peace settlements. More conflicts have ended through negotiations in the last 15 years than not. And that's a good sign. You've got anomalies like the Congo and Eritrea, Ethiopia are likely to go to war again, but it's moving in the right direction. Half the world's now democratic. It means the other half not, but it's better than it was a decade ago.
Where we had more dictators in the world than we do now.
Yeah, and you've got problems. Latin America's inching back towards dictatorships in a lot of places. There are major problems, but it is moving in the right direction. But there's not in our lifetime we're going to see world peace, but I think you can see a progression that your grandchildren's children may.
And that is if more people are fed and more people have the basic needs of what it takes to live a dignified and comfortable life. We're still not very good at distributing the world's assets, are we?
Well, the Secretary General of the UN put forward a very interesting deal to the world last September at the World Summit, where most of the world's leaders came. And he said, look, developed world, the United States and Western Europe, if you want the rest of the world to take nonproliferation and terrorism, your threat, seriously, you have to take their threat seriously, which are different. If you live in the Congo, you don't really care where bin Laden is. But you do care about HIV, infectious diseases, the war, poverty, debt. And so he said, developing world, get serious about nonproliferation. Developed world, get serious about funding the development challenges.
Nancy, Ambassador Soderberg, thank you so much for being here. It flew by. Her book, get it please, it's called The Superpower Myth, The Use and Misuse of American Might. A distinguished visiting professor at UNF. Thanks, we'll see you next time. You have been watching a public access television program called Civil Discourse, sponsored by the American Civil Liberties Union of Greater Jacksonville, Florida. The ACLU is a private, nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization. Our mission is to protect and advance the civil liberties and civil rights guaranteed by the United States Constitution, especially the principles contained in the Bill of Rights. We want to hear from you. Send us an email, share your views and opinions. If you're interested in appearing on the program, let us know. Friend or foe, we want you on the show. You may contact the ACLU in the following ways. Our telephone number is 904-396-5242. Our post office box is 5331 Jacksonville, Florida 32247. And our email address is aclujax@yahoo.com. My name is Ken Hurley. Thank you for participating in Civil Discourse.
watching Local Access, Channel 29, exclusive programming for Comcast subscribers.
Welcome to The Turning Point, a program about literacy and education on Florida's First Coast. I'm Dr. Gail Florence Kane, President of the DePaul School of Northeast Florida, and here representing the Literacy Council of Jacksonville. Today's guest, our first guest, is Terry Allgaier from the DePaul School. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you, Gail.
And I know we have some exciting news to share about DePaul's activities. Tell us what's going on.
Well, actually, DePaul is celebrating a 25th anniversary. Our school started in 1980, and this year we're doing all sorts of events to bring families back together, to celebrate all of our successes, and to inform the community more about DePaul, who we are, and the students that we serve.
And can you tell us a little bit about DePaul's mission, since we are hoping to spread that word?
DePaul's mission is to educate and understand students who have a diagnosed learning difference, such as dyslexia, attention deficits, memory deficits, and auditory and visual processing disorders. These students are extremely smart, but in traditional programs sometimes fall behind. And so when a student comes to DePaul, we use a research-based curriculum that's most appropriate for their educational needs. And usually the students start succeeding almost immediately.
It sounds like a very powerful type of experience for the students. Do they tend to stay in touch with the staff and